Shockingly, many Americans are unaware of the full extent of their country's longest continually running war, the war on drugs. Many citizens support it out of a blind aversion to the idea of drugs, rather than a complete understanding of its policies and the ramifications of those policies for both users and non-users alike. In its 44-year history, the war on drugs has failed to eliminate drugs from society. In fact, more drugs are available at cheaper prices in the United States today than at any other previous time. It has spent billions of dollars holding drug users behind bars while denying them meaningful opportunities to turn their life around, whether through financial assistance, education, or treatment. Prisons are overflowing, people are dying, and the drug trade is not stopping. The war on drugs has been an expensive failure that needs to be seriously reformed by lessening the focus on law enforcement and increasing the amount of treatment programs and education available to the public. For those familiar with the 1971 speech in which then-President Richard Nixon sent the first figurative bullet in the war, these are the words they most often remember. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new, all-out offensive. I have asked Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. These words are belligerent, urgent, and unyielding. They are dangerously black and white. They are also, unfortunately, the words that subsequent presidents like Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, notoriously tough on drugs, have used for their own drug policies. Reagan in particular advocated for increased use of the military in conjunction with drug policy, and Bush famously stated that the government would make room in jail for all of the addicts they would arrest under tougher laws. However, the section of the speech that is often ignored by presidents, governmental officials, and citizens alike demonstrates an understanding of the complexity of the issue. It is a problem which demands compassion and not simply condemnation for those who become the victims of narcotics and dangerous drugs. We must try to better understand the confusion and disillusion and despair that bring people, particularly young people, to the use of narcotics and dangerous drugs. Unfortunately, citizens and officials alike seem to have forgotten these words. Nixon's presidency was the only time in the war's history that the government spent more funding on treatment than it did on law enforcement. In a statistical study conducted by Catherine Beckett, professor at University of California, Los Angeles, results confirm the idea that public figures and the media play a heavy role in the public's perception of drugs, as well as the way the public thinks that drugs should be handled by the government. Politicians arouse public anger through speeches, and through masterful rhetoric, they steer that anger in a desired direction. By framing drug use as a criminal issue, they also present the desired outcome: increased law enforcement. As an example of the power of this sort of rhetoric, in the 8 short years between 1980 and 1988, the percentage of Americans polled by Gallup who believed that possession of a small amount of marijuana should be punished with jail time rose 31% during Reagan's presidency. The next question is probably, so what? If drugs are bad, which, for the most part, they are, then what is wrong with politicians molding public perception around that idea? Shouldn't the government be doing everything in its power to eradicate drugs from the country? The answer is complex and multi-layered, but a war is a complete wrong way to fix America's drug problem. Yes, drugs are bad, and yes, they are harmful both to users and to the community in which users find themselves. However, drugs will always be part of a free society. It is more practical, and therefore more useful, to focus on eliminating the harms of drugs rather than spending so much effort on eliminating the actual drugs themselves. One of the biggest problems with the war on drugs is that it robs addicts of any opportunities they may have to start fresh. This creates what has been termed a permanent underclass of convicted drug users that it is extremely difficult to leave, and many end up turning back to the very same drug or drugs that led them into the situation. Beginning in middle or high school, students who are found to be in possession of a drug are suspended from school, despite the fact that students who are using drugs at this age should be considered at risk and should be kept in. Last year, there were 17 suspensions for illicit drug use in Zionsville. In Pike High School, there were 30. In college, it gets worse. For those students charged or convicted with a drug crime in high school, it can be very difficult to be accepted into college. Even worse, once that drug offense is entered into a student's permanent record, they lose access to federal financial aid, often making it basically impossible for these students to receive any higher education. In a job market that is increasingly viewing a bachelor's degree as the new high school diploma, this sets these students up for failure. Their troubles continue in the job market as it is now difficult for them to find a job or to receive federal financial assistance for unemployment. If the drug user is put into prison, they are given hardly any treatment for their addiction, despite the fact that many people entering the prison system for drug crimes or other reasons have a dependency on at least one drug. At no point in the process is the individual set up for any sort of success. The former Prime Minister of Sweden, Ruth Dreyfus, makes the comment, "You cannot make a war against drugs without making a war against people." America is only perpetuating a vicious cycle of abuse and neglect for users who try but are unable to change their lives for the better. There are still some who may say that drug users bring these repercussions on themselves when they choose to take an illegal substance. While I am personally of the opinion that a mistake should not put you in a disadvantaged position for life, especially when the individual in question would like to turn their life around, everyone is entitled to their own opinion. However, the war on drugs does not harm only those who choose to use illegal substances. It harms taxpayers, the communities in which drug users are located, and even those outside of America's borders thanks to military interventions in foreign countries to help them with their own drug problem. As seen in the cupcake demonstration, prisoners are not cheap. The war on drugs has cost billions of dollars to the taxpayer, whether due to prison, military interventions, or the cost of increased law enforcement. What has the taxpayer seen in response? An increase in the amount of drugs in America thanks to a strong black market. Citizens around the nation, including us here in Zionsville, are paying billions for a failed program. We are also paying for the continuation of bloody drug wars elsewhere around the globe, particularly in Mexico and Colombia. 47,000 individuals have been killed in Mexico alone due to drug-related violence since the conception of its war on drugs. In Colombia, former President Bill Clinton intervened through what was termed Plan Colombia in the hope of aiding the Colombian government in eradicating drug cartels and their supply of drugs, primarily cocaine. Thousands lost their lives at the crossroads of the drug and the law, and thousands of farmers saw their livelihoods destroyed by chemicals sprayed by helicopters that sought the cocoa plant, but also killed surrounding crops. Today, Clinton recognizes the error of his past actions. If all you do is try to find a police or military solution to the problem, a lot of people die and it doesn't solve the problem. The ills of drug policy are not limited to only those who use drugs, and the ills should be considered violations of human rights that we all, as compassionate and caring citizens, should be outraged about. Even if all of these problems did not exist, and in the highly unlikely event that a war was the best way to combat drugs, there would still be one last issue. A war on drugs is simply unwinnable. The military's best efforts are largely unproductive and only result in bloodshed, as previously stated, and even a largely successful intervention will only move the black market elsewhere. There are simply too many cartels. The only true way to win a war on drugs is to end it, and an important first step is to decrease law enforcement for drug crimes. Focus should be taken off of arresting drug users and should be moved towards helping them end their dependency on drugs. The harm reduction model seeks to minimize the damage of drugs done both to the community and to the user through a more practical and compassionate approach to addiction. It acknowledges that illegal drug use is, and most likely always will be, a part of American society, and that pretending otherwise is counterproductive. Rather than focus on complete and total abstinence from all drugs, it strives to achieve security for drug-using individuals and for the community at large by teaching safe use of drugs and by giving addicts a voice in their treatment. Choosing to not partake in any drug of any kind would of course be the safest and healthiest route, but realistically, not everyone will choose that path. The harm reduction model advocates for increased treatment options for everyone from an occasional user to a heavy abuser, so that better quality of life can be established. It argues that addiction is a sensitive and complex issue that should be treated medically rather than in courts. In order for abusers to truly overcome their addictions and to be able to return to being functioning and contributing members of society rather than simply languishing inside of a jail cell. Of course, what's even better than treatment is preventative education. Much like abstinence-only sexual education does not fully prepare its pupils for the potential pitfalls that come with being sexually active, drug education that focuses only on avoiding drugs does not adequately provide its students with information to avoid the negative consequences of drugs. According to a study done by Susan T. Ennett, Ph.D., and her colleagues at UNC Chapel Hill that analyzed the outcome reports of DARE, the reports that follow up with students to assess the effectiveness of the program in deterring students from drugs, the only drug that DARE has a marginal success of deterring students from is tobacco. Other studies have been performed and determined that DARE does nothing to steer students away from drugs. In fact, the amount of Americans using illegal drugs is increasing. The current form of drug education is mocked by students across America, whether for its cheesy lines or for the fact that they know that they are being lied to. In a website founded by the DEA, methisdeath.com, they report that 95 and later 99% of meth users became addicted to the drug on their first time. While meth is clearly and undisputably an extremely dangerous drug, there are no sources, and these numbers are clearly an exaggerated hyperbole grabbed purely out of the air. Young students recognize this and similar scare tactics and are less likely to take the information seriously. We need more comprehensive drug education that does not treat students as if they are unintelligent and that leaves them more prepared to navigate the potential pitfalls of drug use. There aren't any drug cartels traveling down Main Street, and most of us have the financial resources to rebuild our lives after a drug charge or addiction. However, we still feel negative effects of the drug war around us, especially in schools. As previously stated, Zionsville suspends students caught with drugs despite the fact that these students should really be kept in school. At Pike, a student caught with drugs is allowed to switch out a suspension or expulsion in favor of a drug recovery class. This opportunity is only granted once, but it is still a step in the right direction. Allowing students to make healthy changes to their lives rather than brand them with permanent charges is an excellent idea. Zionsville might do well to follow that lead. In conclusion, the government fails to recognize the destructive effects of their failed war on drugs. In fact, every time a drug-related disaster occurs, they only increase spending and further toughen laws. It would appear that the government has a dependency on its own drug war, just like addicts have a dependency on their drugs. This has cost the American people over $1 trillion since its conception, and has cost even more in terms of human loss. Tens of thousands of lives lost, and hundreds of thousands more destroyed through cruel punishments and military interventions. Are you comfortable with your tax dollars, either through sales tax or income tax, funding the degradation of your fellow Americans, the destruction of poor farmers' livelihoods, and a prison industrial complex that is quickly becoming wildly out of control? Tell your representatives how you feel. Their contact information, as well as several agencies attempting to end the war, are on the screen. It's time the government goes back to helping its citizens instead of kicking them while they're down.